Welcome to the We Rise podcast, where we are building collective resilience. I'm your host, Christine Gyovai, business owner, wife, mother of two, paddleboarder, and I love working with communities across the nation. Join me as I share stories and strategies to inspire action to build resilience and community transformation. From the Navajo Nation to the mountains of Appalachia, incredible work is being done by community members and leaders. I'm excited to share more on the podcast today. Welcome. In this episode of the We Rise podcast, we're focusing on plants, gardening like a forest, and planting for pollinators. You may have heard about edible forest gardens, which is gardening like a forest, which has gained in popularity in recent years. We are going to do a deep dive today into how they work and what you can do to create a simple forest garden or even a more complex one if you're interested. We do a lot of ecological design work with our firm, Dialogue and Design Associates, and many people ask us how to create gardens that build soil and increase the health of the ecosystems around us. Our clients are often very interested, but they're usually not quite sure where to start. For a long time now, primary approach to growing food and large-scale agriculture has been to extract, to take, but to not necessarily give back, to not grow soil, to not add compost back. We have often in society become consumers consuming, and in some regards, we've forgotten how to produce, how to create, how to regenerate, and how to restore. One way to create more than we consume is with how we grow food. While there are many ways to garden, one way that has been practiced in different ways around the globe is forest gardening. And this is just what it sounds like, gardening just the way nature does. We've had a forest garden for about 10 years now, and it is such a source of delight and joy and learning for myself, our family, and our firm. People often ask, well, how does nature build a garden? The first step is to observe a forest or a prairie or a desert, whatever the ecosystem is where you live, which you can mimic in your own garden, whether that's a container, a spot in a community garden, or a large-scale kitchen garden. In today's episode, we're going to focus on a forest and how a forest grows a garden. The very first step is to notice what you see and to pay attention. One of the first things we observe is there are several layers in a forest, not just one height of a plant or type of a plant growing. Some of these layers include low shrubs, mid-sized trees, and vines crawling their ways around, and plants that grow right above the soil, the herbaceous layer we most commonly grow in our gardens. Forests also grow many different kinds of plants with lots of diversity that serve many different functions, and this is really key. And it's often very different than the way we have our own kitchen gardens. In forested ecosystems, some plants attract pollinators, others provide food, fruit, and medicine, and still others bring up nutrients from deep in the soil and make it available to other plants. Many trees share nutrients and even messages with each other, such as when extra nutrients are needed by a certain tree, and actually the nutrients are shared through a root system that is commonly held and networks of mycelium and fungi. Plants actually develop relationships with each other and they help each other out. It is so cool. Animals are often an integral part of forests. For example, wild turkeys move through and scratch at the ground looking for insects and turning the soil, often helping the leaves break down and adding their own nutrients to the soil. They move together as a flock and act like a moving compost machine, eating insects and helping to grow the soil. As some trees and shrubs and plants die, they slowly break down to make nutrients available to other plants over time as they decompose, as the cycle builds health, regeneration, and stability and instability over time. There's still cycles working together. The leaves of different plants drop at different times throughout the fall and winter, making food available to other species throughout the cold months. The beech tree is one of the last to lose its leaves, Fagus grandiflora. Oh, such a beautiful tree. As the leaves of beech fall in late winter, they become much needed food for aquatic animals and invertebrates or bugs in streams and rivers when there isn't much else available. There are cycles, again, working upon cycles in a forest garden, and they are often mutually beneficial. They help each other out. At the same time, there's competition for light, nutrients, and resources. Some things live, some things die, but the insects, plants, and animals that die become food and resources for the other parts of the ecosystem. They are parts working together for a greater synergistic whole that is greater for the sum of its parts. We've looked a little bit at the forest scale. We've talked about what types of plants there can be, the different functions that different species can have and animals. When we turn that to the home scale and we apply these principles within our own kitchen gardens, it can be helpful to start small if we begin our own forest garden. Mimicking the layers of a forest, there are many plants we can grow in an edible forest garden that occupy different niches and have different needs for light, moisture, and nutrients. For example, in the root layer of a forest garden, we could grow potatoes or carrots. For the plants that grow right above the soil, the herbaceous layer, we could grow lettuce or kale. The ground cover layer, which are plants that spread out and often form kind of a mat or a dense layer above the ground. They can spread out across the ground. Those might include strawberries or chamomile. Shrubs are a fabulous layer to include in forest gardens. You often don't need to bend over as far to harvest, and they're very often low maintenance. These could include blueberries, currants, or raspberries. Low-story plants are higher than shrubs, but still small trees, including maybe dwarf peach trees or figs. And then we get into an upper story of an edible forest garden, and they might include apples or persimmon trees, and vining plants can include peas or grapes. The first place to start is to do just that. Just start, experiment, try something out, see what works. You can start with something as small as a 4-foot by 4-foot area of ground. You might include a dwarf pear tree, raspberries around a few corners of the patch to allow access to prune the tree and to harvest, strawberries to cover the ground, as well as radishes, which are quick to grow and they love cool weather. So you can harvest them before the raspberries start to ripen with leaves shading out the strawberry plants. That's just one example. There are so many different combinations you can try, but the point is to just start, to just try, experiment, have fun, and see what works. So the next step after you've started is to observe your forest garden patch. How is it growing? What is thriving? What isn't thriving? Do you want to try something different? Maybe carrots as a rooting plant in the next year. Experimenting, seeing what works and what doesn't, and paying attention is the key to knowing what is happening in your forest garden. Or you might decide to add a nitrogen fixing plant to the mix, which absorbs nitrogen from the air with the help of a bacteria, rhizobium, and it converts nitrogen gas into an available form for plants to use, and it stores it in the plant's roots, making it available to other plants, which is so cool. Nitrogen is a needed nutrient for plants to grow, and we can intentionally add these plants to our forest gardens to be able to provide nutrients for trees that really need them, and shrubs and other plants. Many folks say to plant one nitrogen fixing plant for every major feeder tree or shrub. One of our favorite nitrogen fixing plants in our own forest garden in Central Virginia is called New Jersey tea, or Ceanothus americanus. It's a small shrub about 2 to 3 feet in height with many diverse functions and uses. The dried leaves of New Jersey tea make an excellent tea with many medicinal uses. It's been used as a substitute for imported tea. It's native to the eastern United States, and it attracts a large number of pollinators, including native bees and hummingbirds. Songbirds eat the seeds of this beautiful, drought-tolerant plant. New Jersey tea has a deep taproot, which makes it great for hillsides and slopes, though it doesn't want to sit in wet soil and needs a well-drained site. So that's a little glimpse into a specific plant that we love, that we've used a lot in our edible forest garden, and you can experiment and see what nitrogen-fixing plants you might want to include in yours. There are several great ones to choose from. With our own forest garden in Central Virginia, we've focused quite a bit on pollinators. We put our forest garden in with a workshop that we held at our place, Fiddlehead Farm, almost 10 years ago. We have a little less than an acre that we've planted in the forest garden, and we really treat it as our research plot. We also add a lot of love and care, but not necessarily a lot of active maintenance, and this is an intentional choice. We have kitchen gardens, which we more actively maintain, but our forest garden is the place where we try things out, we experiment, we see what works, what doesn't, what plants make it, what don't. It's where we're actively learning. It's where we test things out. We know what to recommend to clients and what not to recommend, as well as strategies. Building collective resilience looks different in different places. Resilience means growing a stronger, brighter future for generations to come. It also takes many shapes and comes in different sizes. Resilience includes building community, a healthier environment, and robust local economies. It also means growing equity, inclusion, and belonging, care of self and others, and creating regeneration at all levels. What stories and strategies inspire you? Share your ideas with us on social media and check out our website at yeswerise.org to find the show notes interview videos, and the links mentioned on the podcast today. Beyond that, there have been some unexpected side benefits from the forest garden. Establishing our own edible forest garden is what helped me enter into relationship with the land that we steward. As with most of my work in collaboration and with communities, in this project with the land, I listened first. I paid attention to what needed to happen at the top of the slope we were planting on, and what needed to happen mid-slope and at the bottom. When we planted the forest garden, the hillside was covered in brambles. We first rotated 2 heritage breed pigs in movable grazing paddocks to clear the land. Then we established a swale or a ditch on contour at the top of the forest garden to capture water from an upper meadow in our driveway to keep the forest garden well watered over time. Basically, the water comes and it's directed towards the swale and it spreads out horizontally across the landscape and slowly percolates into the groundwater. Now, some people say that it takes about 3 years for a more permanent underground lens of water to form, but we do know that the forest garden has become much more well watered with the water in the swale. With our small Kubota tractor, we subsoiled furrows on contour, or another way to say that is we pulled a small single shank or single level plow that would cut thin, deep lines in the soil, but not turn the soil over, which is important to not expose too much oxygen to the soil to keep the topsoil intact. It just basically cuts these furrowed rips, if you will, through the soil. And we did that on contour, or if you imagine topo lines, topography lines going across the landscape, we cut those with the topography. This helped encourage water to spread out across the landscape as it ran down the hillside in the future forest garden and into the furrows rather than just running off and eventually down into the creek. So we helped spread and slow the water into the soil. We also really helped grow the soil, and you'll hear about that in a moment, but the pigs were an initial first important strategy to help clear the land, add fertilizer, and help grow the health of the soil. We planted several different layers of plants in the forest garden. These included apple trees that I grafted a few years before we planted the forest garden, and some additional fruit trees we purchased with tastes of fruit that we loved. We tasted lots and lots and lots of things first before we selected the plants. We also focused on cultivars, or different species and varieties of plants that were disease resistant, so we didn't need to use chemicals, and others with a variety of ripening times and different uses, such as fruit for fresh eating, maybe making cider or applesauce. Some of these varieties included Gold Rush apple, the Admiral Pippin apple, Burford pear, Celeste fig, and Susquehanna pawpaw, and several others. So much fun. Some trees made it, some didn't. Our Asian persimmons did not make it. Our pawpaws thrive. The apples and pears we actively maintain, we prune, we kept them weeded for the first 3 years. We kept a lot of mulch on them, and we really cared for those plants. Now that we're entering our 10th year, our maintenance strategy has really changed over time. Initially, when we planted the fruit trees, the largest plants, we spaced them out about 15 feet apart. We then planted shrubs in between the fruit trees, including New Jersey tea, again nitrogen fixing, Baptisia, which is also nitrogen fixing, as well as raspberries, blueberries, jostberry, aronia, and several additional plants at that shrub layer. Ground cover plants included wild ginger, strawberries, lots of flowers and medicinals, including joe pie weed, sunchokes, echinacea, marshmallow, and many other plants. Bee balm has thrived. We have daffodils going up the hillside that are the first thing to bloom, and it's just simply beautiful throughout the entire year. One plant that has been an unexpected delight is Reichenbaching 14 comfrey, which grows about 3 to 4 feet tall, and pollinators love its deep purple blooms. We can cut it back a few times a year and spread its leaves around as a mulch, a technique known as chop and drop. Comfrey is also known as a dynamic accumulator. It brings nutrients up from deep in the ground and makes them available to other plants. We put down very thick cardboard around the plants when we first planted the forest garden, and we mulched everything heavily when we established it, with ground up wood chip mulch as well as pine bark mulch. That really helped the plants get established and keep them relatively weed-free that first year especially. We have pathways in between the forest garden beds, and today we mow those pathways which are established on contour, and occasionally we run our chicken tractor along them. We also weed trees and brambles out that we don't want to grow in the forest garden because new things will sprout. We keep bees along the perimeter in their own bee yard. We also fence the forest garden to keep the deer out, but it's very close to our house, so we see and interact with it daily. Some plants have made it and some haven't, but it's a place we eat from often, learn from daily, and we love seeing the pollinators frequent the forest garden. If you're interested in learning more about plants that are helpful for pollinator conservation, check out the Xerces Society at xerces.org, which is xerces.org. Love this organization. According to Xerces, pollinators are responsible for the reproduction of over 85% of the world's flowering plants. This organization offers information about pollinator conservation across regions and several additional resources about plants, the benefits of pollinators, and things you can do at home. Focusing on growing plants for pollinators is an excellent place to start to garden, which can be in an edible forest garden or in a simple pathway known as a pollinator pathway. The first time I was introduced to pollinator pathways, I was visiting my sister in Western Massachusetts, and there's an organization that's dedicated to handing out plant kits so people can plant pollinator strips in median strips or right outside their front yards, but they've made it very easy to be able to plant different plants to attract pollinators, and I love this term pollinator pathway. According to a group known as Pollinator pathways are private and public pesticide-free corridors of native plants that provide nutrition and habitats for pollinating insects and birds. Even the smallest green spaces like flower boxes or curb strips can be part of a pathway. You can also check out what pollinator plants are good for where you live in the United States by searching your zip code at their website, pollinator-pathway.org. According to the organization, because the pollinator pathway defragments the environment, it benefits our whole ecosystem. Our landscape has been chopped up or fragmented through urbanization and suburbanization. The problem is we can no longer support sustainable populations of wildlife in our isolated parks and preserves alone, as Dr. Doug Tallamy, University of Delaware entomologist, argues so eloquently in his book, Bringing Nature Home, which is a fabulous read. Luckily, there's a solution. If we begin to manage our own yards organically with native plantings, we can use them to connect parks and preserves, creating crucial corridors for wildlife. And that is the idea behind Pollinator Pathway. So cool. So if you're looking for more specifics, some Northeast United States native trees suggested by Doug Tallamy that are major sources of pollen and nectar for pollinators include, these are from early blooming to late, maple, willow, mid-blooming black cherry, as well as tulip poplar, and later blooming basswood and sumac. No matter where you're located around the globe, there are native plants that have developed relationships with pollinators over time for hundreds and thousands of years, and there are tons of great resources available to learn more about plants where you live. According to the pollinator pathway, pollinators are also key for food production. I love this. We can't eat without pollinators. Pollination enables the plants in our yards, parks, farms, and orchards to reproduce. Imported European honeybees are the bees we think about the most, but there are actually over 4,000 species of bees native to the United States, and they play a vital role in pollinating the plants we rely on in our communities. Bee populations, both native and honeybees, have seen sharp declines. Monarchs, as many of you know, have declined by 94% in the last 20 years, according to the U.S. Wildlife Federation. And a recent German study shows a 75% decline in all flying insects in the last 25 years. However, I love that there's something that we can do to easily grow plants for pollinators and grow food, whether that's creating a pollinator pathway, starting a forest garden, or just putting a couple native plant seeds in a pot outside your front door. It all begins with each one of us starting small, taking one step and putting one foot in front of the other, and connecting with each other. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know we firmly believe the collective is more effective. The Pollinator Pathway Project is organized by volunteers from towns and conservation organizations working together to establish pollinator-friendly habitat and food sources for bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, and other pollinating insects and wildlife along a series of continuous corridors. Most native bees have a range of about 750 meters, so the goal is to connect properties that are no farther apart than that. The project began in 2017 in Wilton, Connecticut, and since then pathways have been established in over 200 towns across the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast in the United States, and the list keeps growing. So inspiring and so fun to learn about. You can check out this episode's show notes to see the Pollinator Project's favorite plants, as well as their website for more information. So we encourage you to experiment, to try things out, plant a few new pollinators, and let us know how it goes. We're excited to see your pictures of your forest garden, your pollinator pathways, and the new places that you steward as they grow. Send us a note at our contact info at yeswerise.org or send us a message on social. Together, we are growing a brighter future. Enjoy. Hello, solution seekers and change makers. We are glad and grateful for the work you are doing in the world. To learn more about the stories and speakers featured in this episode, check out our website at yeswerise.org. You'll find the show notes, interview videos, and the links mentioned today, and you can join our email list. Subscribe to the show to catch every new episode wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It so helps others find the podcast too. You can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Yes We Rise to share your ideas. Enjoy!